Yesterday, Chaim Fear asked a question. I didn't have the answer. We had that case with the Mayim Shuvim. So there was a mikvah that had exactly 40 saw, and someone came and added to it some type of mei paris, and then took out a full jug of water. So now we have a little bit of shmilsa. So now we have a little bit less content than 40 saw. So the halacha that we said was, is that up until roiv, you're allowed to use that mikvah. Once you're left in the roiv, you can't use the mikvah. So the Gemara wanted to try to bring a raya from there that according to Rabbi Yochanan, that you would need roiv to be matter even by a drabana. The problem that we had is that mei paris is asur deraisa. That was the kasha that was asked. Mei paris asur deraisa. So surely you should need roiv. So that really was Tosfos' kasha. And Tosfos has three terutzim. I'll focus more on two of the three. One teretz that Tosfos says is that maybe the type of mei paris we're talking about is temed. It's something that's mostly water anyway. So therefore, we're dealing with water, mayim shuvim. The other teretz that Tosfos says is, since when you first poured in the first bit of mei paris, that mei paris was bottled. Well, that was bottled in the existing water already. So since it's bottled in the existing water, chiddush, he says, is it's more in Rashi. Tosfos says it's bottled, but Rashi still uses the word she'uven. Rashi still says it's she'uven. So they're medayik from Rashi that even though when you put the mei paris in, it becomes bottled to the water, but it still retains a status of mayim shuvim. So it's bottled lagabi that it's not mei paris anymore, but it's still considered mayim shuvim. And therefore, there's a psul d'Rabbanan that we're dealing with, and that's why the discussion of whether you needed rev or not would be very relevant, even to a shaila of a d'Rabbanan. So that explains that Gemara, and I didn't know this yesterday because I was tired when I was preparing, and I saw that Tosfos, but I was too lazy to really understand it well. And now I learned my lesson. Indeed. Now that we have people here, I'm going to turn the main camera on. Okay, wonderful. So now we're up to the Gemara on Amud Aleph, and the Gemara started with Rav, for the last two words on the Pei Beis and Beis, with Rav saying Lesa Lahai Lesa Lamasnisin the Kamabraisa. Our Mishnah that quotes Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon stating that Bevadoyis, that Droigenis is a Zachar, will not be. We will not follow the Mishnah because the Brisa says that Rabbi Yosy says a different halacha, and we're going to follow the Brisa. Lesa Lamasnisin the Kamabraisa. The Tanya Rabbi Yosy Omer Androgenis beria b'fnei atzmahu. And androgenis is a beria b'fnei atzma lo yichriu b'chachamim imzachirim nekeva. So clearly, it's not a vadei zachar. So, frankly, Gemara, why would you say that the Brice's version of Rabbi Yosy is accurate and not the Mishnah? Adrabah, say lesser the Brice and become a Masnisim. Let's say that the Mishnah is right in what Rabbi Yosy's opinion was, and in fact, an androgenis is a vadei male. Zok to Gemara, if we had a Mishnah that was saying what Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon said, and we have a Brice that says what Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon said, maybe we would go back to the Brisa if it's later. But here, the Brisa doesn't quote both Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon that it's a suffix. Rather, it's Rabbi Yosy alone in the Brisa. Because it says the Tanya Rabbi Yosy, it leaves out Rabbi Shimon. Mideshavke Rabbi Yosy lebar zuge. Since in the Brisa, when the Tana quotes, it only quotes Rabbi Yosy and doesn't quote Rabbi Shimon. Shemami no hadabei. That must mean that Rabbi Yosy is no longer in sync with his partner Reb Shimon, and Reb Yosy himself changed his psak and paskin that an androgynous is a suffix. Ushmuel Amar, so that was Rav's opinion. So Rav's opinion was that the final version of Rabbi Yosy is that the androgynous remains a suffix. Shmuel said, "Less celebrate from the common season." Shmuel disagrees with Rav and says Rabbi Yosy's psak remains that an androgynous is a vadizah. Correct Gemara, maybe say fakir. Ada b'lasa l'maslisim mekamen braysa. The hashma'ini Shmuel, because we actually know Shmuel has another shita that we learned on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. He's choishes to Hashita Siyachid, the Chayish Lichida. So maybe we should be choished to the Rabbi Yosy in the Brisa, who says that an androgynous is a suffix. So Dr. Gemara, when does Shmuel say you're choishes Lichida, Hanimili Keloi Misaker Masnisim? That's if it won't totally end up bypassing the Mishnah. Avoki Misaker Masnisim. Like for here, if you're going to say it's a suffix, it can't be a vada. It can't be both. If you're going to pass that it's a suffix, he's not going to be able to be Michael, his wife Truma. So clearly it'll be totally okay. The Mishnah loy chayish. In such a case, Shmuel is not chayish lechida. Amri Bei Rav Mishmei Rav. Bei Rav said in the name of Rav. Who are Bei Rav? Bei Rav actually it depends on the context what Bei Rav is. Rashi tells us here that it's going to become very clear on Amud Beis that Bei Rav over here is Rav Huna. So this is Rav Rav Huna Mishmei Rav. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. Halacha Rabbi Yosy bandrogenes. The halacha is Rabbi Yosy bandrogenes, which would mean the halacha that we're learning that androgenes is a vadei sofer. Ubehar kava and halachas legabe harkava, which is agriculture related, which we'll get into in detail shortly. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel said, where is the halacha like Rabbi Yosy? Bikushi ubekiddush, and we'll get into what those are as well. So it's interesting. Rav made it clear that we paskin like Rabbi Yosy in two cases. Shmuel says it's clear we paskin like Rabbi Yosy in different two cases. So the Gemara is going to want to know what does Shmuel hold about Rav's cases and what does Rav hold about Shmuel's cases, and the Gemara is going to go through them later. So the first case where Rav said we paskin like Rabbi Yosy is androgynous, that it's a vadei zocher. What is that case? Had Amran, exactly what we just learned, that the androgynous is a vadei zocher. And let's go back and look again. Omar Rav, lesser lemasnisim mekamen braysa. Here Rav says that we don't pass like the Mishnah, we pass like the braysa. So really, I have to. It's a little bit funny because halacha Rabbi Yosy, which is what we just said from Bei Rav, is halacha Rabbi Yosy the masnisim that it's a vadai. So let's see Rashi here. But Amri Bei Rav, who is Bei Rav? Hani Rav Huna, Chidla Kaman like we'll see in Amr Aleph. Upolig Ada Amr La'il Alibu de Rav. That less lemasnisim. A moment ago we quoted Rav as saying we don't pass like our Mishnah that Rabbi Yosy holds androgynous is a suffix because that's what Rabbi Yosy said at the end. Rather, this Rav Huna is departing from what the Gemara said earlier and says in fact that we pass that Rav passes like Rabbi Yosy of the Mishnah that androgynous is a vadei zocher. So androgynous hadamor harkava. What is the case of harkava? That's not learned. Ain't one may not plant, vein mavrichin, and one may not be mavrich. The definition of mavrich is if I take a vine, for instance, and I want it to grow into a second vine, I'll take one of its branches, I'll bring it down under the ground, and then back up again. So part of the branch is underground that I'll cover with earth, that'll start sprouting, and that will make the second plant grow as an independent plant. That's not allowed to be done. The ein markivin, you're not allowed to graft two trees. So if I want to create a better fruit, I'll take two trees, I'll make a hole in the trunk of one tree, I'll take the branch from another tree, bend it over and connect it into the hole. Maybe I'll peel the bark off so it's raw, and I stick it into the hole in the other tree, and eventually they fuse together, and the genetics of both those trees produce a superior fruit. So all of these activities are not allowed to be done Erev Shvius, the year before the Shemitah year, Pachas Mishloishim Yom L'fnei Rosh Hashanah, within 30 days of Rosh Hashanah. So basically, from Rosh Chodesh Elul, one may not do any activities that's going to improve the growth of anything in a field because that's called violating the Shemitah. The imnota, if someone violated and planted a tree within that period of time, 30 days before the Shemitah year, or v'hivrich, which is once again pulling the branch down into the ground and up again to create a second tree, or v'hirkiv, or grafting, yakar, it must be uprooted. Rashi says deka kolta b'shvius, because it turns out that when did it take root? It took root on Shvius, on the Shemitah year. The ein harkava kailetes b'pachas mishloshim len. When you do harkava, it takes 30 days for it to bond into the new tree and connect, and therefore this happened to have occurred. Even if you actually did the physical action of the connection before the period that it was usher, its impact is going to occur on the usher during the usher period, and therefore it's going to be usher.
I don't understand. That harkava is bending a branch of a tree, or is it a vine, or what is that?
It has to be something that's soft enough that you can actually bend.
Okay, but why would it grow in it? Why would it be independent of the first tree if it's still connected?
Because I think eventually it's going to take root and then develop its own tree. So the question is, why don't you just cut the branch off and plant it separately? Why do you have to bend it down and up again? I guess it grows better that way because it's still being nourished while it's taking root.
How does it? What do you mean? Roots will grow out of the branch?
Yes, roots will grow out of the branch that's on the ground. And that it makes sense because every time I tried to plant aravas, they never grew. So just cutting off a twig and putting it into the ground hasn't worked. And then after some studying, I learned that in order to grow aravas, you have to first keep aravas in a jar, in a very sunlit place for months until they actually sprout roots. And once they sprout roots, only then can you place them in the ground. Because if you just stick a twig into the ground, it doesn't have the tools to suck the nourishment out of the ground. So it's just going to die. So you first have to get it to have a series of roots, which will allow it to suck nourishment from the ground. Then you can put it into the ground. So it could be that's why you would be maverick. Because if you just cut off a piece of branch and stuck it in the ground, its chance of survival is low. But if it's connected to the tree, so then it's still taking nourishment from its mother tree as it's also trying to grow its own roots. Unlike a baby, where it's literally from 1 second to the next. From 1 second, it's taking nourishment from its brother's umbilical cord, and then when it comes out, it suddenly changes, and now it's being nourished through its mouth. This is a way of transitioning from the nourishment of its tree, of its mother tree, to its nourishment directly from the karka. So let's see what it says over here. If you did it, you have to be oiker. So it's interesting that there's a distinct difference between Isurim of Zuriya on Shabbos versus Isurim of Zuriya on Shemitah. On Shabbos, if you put a seed in the ground, even if it doesn't take root until tomorrow, you're going to be chayiv because of Zareya. On Shvius, you will not. And the difference is very simple. Because on Shabbos, the Isser is the malacha that you're doing. The Isser is on the person. On Shvius and Shemitah, the Isser is not to work the land. It's a din in the land. So therefore, we focus on when the impact occurred. When you actually did the physical ma'isa isn't relevant like it is on Shabbos. What's relevant is when it's going to have an impact, when it's going to start sprouting into the ground. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol harkava she'eina keletes b'shloisha yomim shuv eina keletes. You know how long it takes a harkava to start connecting? It takes 3 days, not longer than 3 days. Which means if you did this harkava more than 3 days before the Isser period, there wouldn't be a problem. Rabbi Yosy, Rabbi Shimon Omer, and this is who we're talking about, Rav Paskin, like Rabbi Yosy, by harkava, they say shtei Shabbosos. It's 2 weeks. As long as you did this thing 2 weeks before, then whatever impact it has to have will occur within 2 weeks of that harkava. And if that turns out that that 2 week period is before the Isser period, then you don't have a problem. Rav Nachman giving explanation is the 2 week period or the 30-day period or the 3-day period. That's not 3 days before Rosh Hashanah, the last couple of days of El. The whole month of Elul is already considered a Shemitah year. Therefore, the Divrei Omer Shloishim, if you order like 30 days for these things to have an impact, then you can't start doing this for Chodesh El. you have to start doing this with Chodesh Av, because the impact has to be already complete even before Elul, because Elul already has a halacha of Shemitah where it's also to do certain activities in the field. That's right. That's right. And if you hold this only 3 days, tzarich shloisha, do shloishim. So the month before Rosh Hashanah is already considered Shemitah. Everything has to start before. And the Devar Amish Shtei Shabbosos, tzarich Shtei Shabbosos u'shloishim. And Rashi tells us that the shloishim is the whole shloishim l'fnei shviyas k'shviyas tamim. The month before Shviyas or Elul is already considered Shemitah, and you know that from a pasuk. The nafkalon ibecharish ubechatzer tishbois mashlim v'shlochem, that whatever is normally done as part of the growth of the field, even if it's done before, but it's attributed to that year, is going to be usher, and that's why anything from 30 days before is usher. U'shmuel Amar, and Shmuel said that the koishi the kiddush. By these two halachas, we also pass like Rabbi Yosy. What are the case of koishi? Koishi did not. Now, when you go into a convenience store, the beauty of going into a convenience store is that anything you need is available to you 24 hours a day. And even if you need energy to keep moving, you can get that too 24 hours a day. But we also know that anything you buy in a convenience store is much, much more expensive than buying it at Costco. So that's not much different than a woman. Your wife is very convenient. She has whatever you need for her 24 hours a day. She'll get up in the middle of the night to take care of the kids, but they're very expensive. So that's why the convenience store that we're all familiar with is called 7-Eleven. Why? Because a woman's cycle is 7-Eleven. There's 7 days, and if she sees dam in those 7 days, she becomes Anida. And after those 7 days, there's a period of 11 days that if she sees dam, it's considered Ziva. So I always wondered where that name came from, 7-Eleven. It came from because the ultimate convenience is like having a wife who's always there for you 24/7 to give you whatever you need, but it comes with a cost. So therefore, it's 7-Eleven. So the halacha is, if a woman sees dam 1 day in that 11-day period of Yimei Ziva, she's a Zavaktana Shemer Shem Keneged Join, which means she only has to keep 1 day of Nekiyim, and then she's Tahar again. However, if she sees 3 days in that period, she becomes a Zavak. Now, our minhag nowadays is no matter what, if a woman sees Tipas Dam Kechadol, she has to sit Shiva Nekiyim. But the Deraisa, we're much more machmer than the Deraisa. But the Deraisa is that she's only considered a Ziva if she sees 3 days in a row in that time period, in the 11-day time period. So what happens if a woman is expecting and she sees dam 3 days in a row, but while she's seeing dam, she's having labor pains? Now, dam leda, blood that comes out due to a leda, is not tummy, does not metamer. Of course, we're makar on every dam nowadays. I'm talking about the deraisa. Dam leda won't be metamer. So the halacha is, if a woman is having terrible labor pains, and this is going on for days, and she sees dam 3 days in a row, but then she has her baby right afterwards, while she's still having her labor pains, we'll say that she's not tummy machmat ziva. Why? Because we'll say this is not dam ziva. This is dam leda. However, what happens if the pain stops? She continues to see dam, and then she gives birth. Well, that proves that pain that she had was not labor pain, because labor pain doesn't go away until after the baby's born. So therefore, it tells us, I'm afraid, that she was a son. So this idea of when a woman's having labor pains, any dam that she sees is identified not as dam ziva, but as dam leda. Will that happen even if she sees dam all 9 months, or maybe only if it's closer to her leda? When does that apply? So we learned as follows. That's not we learned. Kama yehei kishuya. How long before she gives birth will we attribute the labor pains to labor and say she's not a zav? 40 or 50 days before she actually gives birth. So that means like from the beginning or from the towards the end of the 8th month. That's when the pain starts counting. If she has pain starting in the 3rd month, that doesn't count. That's for sure ziva. The only time we would consider something to be koshi machmas leda is if it's within 40 or 50 days. And the 40 and the 50, depending on if it's a healthy woman, it's 40. If it's not such a healthy woman, then it's 50. If she has pain, and that pain goes all the way until the day of her birth, until she actually gives birth, and there was dam in the meantime, that would be attributed to dam leida and not dam ziva. That's the shita of Reb Meir. Rabbi Yudaimer, daya chadasha. It's only the 9th month. It's only the 9th month, which is very interesting because normally you look at the term of her pregnancy and you think, how long before she gives birth can you say it's dam leida? Rabbi Yudah says no. It has to do with the 9th month. It has nothing to do with how far before the pregnancy is. So it's totally in the month. Somehow the month would cause that pain. Rashi says the Gemara refers to such a term as shipur agarim, the shofar that they blow when they're mekadosh the chodesh. That is what causes the pain of leida to come. So therefore, let's say she had her baby 3 days into her 9th month. That would only give her 3 free days of koshi. What if she had the baby at the end of the 9th month? That would have given her a whole month. So the amount of days that we'll attribute the koshi leda, the dam leda, the dam during pain as dam leda and not dam ziva depends on the month. We have Yosy, Reb Shimon, which is who Shmuel Paskins like. Amrim ein kishu Yosy mishtei Shabbos. 2 weeks. 2 weeks before she gives birth, that pain will attribute to Leda, and therefore dam will be dam Leda. But if she had pain before that, and she had dam, we will not attribute to Leda. That's dam ziva. Rabbi Yosy also doesn't have to do the chodesh. That's right. It's all timing from before the actual Leda. Rabbi Shimon, that's right. Kiddush. What about halach of kiddush? That's referring to ashering something because of klaya karen. It's none. What if you take your vine and you put it over the tvu of your chaver, which will in essence make it klaya karen, hareza kiddush? That aser your friend, you did it against your friend's will, yet you're able to aser his tvu, but you're going to have to pay him because you caused all of his tvu to become aser bano. Divrei Reb Meir. Rabbi Yosy, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon say a big chiddush, and they say ein adam oiser davar she'ein shaloi. A person cannot aser something that's not his, and therefore, if you put your client, you put your vine over someone's tvu, it will not aser. Zok Toysus in Peimer in Maishna minoisen nevela oy chelev betavshol shal chaveri shenesa. Why don't you say there ain't other oiser davar she'ein shaloi? That's a different question. V'amari the bedavar hatoli b'machshava who the amar hafi. Something that's totally mitzias and taste. There, of course, you're asering davar shein shlucha. The taste is there, but something that's totally in machshava, something that you're das of what you're doing when you do it, that actually has an impact. Because the coin could be mifagel. It's a very good point. The coin could be mifagel a carbon that's not his. That's right. So Zok Gemara, like an example, if you bow down to your friend's animal, so now you want to make it into a nevad, it wouldn't answer it. Even if you try shechting your friend's animal, there's a mandam will hold that you didn't answer it because it's your machshava of avodah zarah. Shechting an animal is an answer. It's not a mitzias. It's your machshava the iser. You can't answer with your machshava someone else's item. And the Isser Kalayim, which is our subject here, Nami Toli b'machshava, is also Toli b'machshava. The Davar b'Sachas Kalayim. So he brings a right that it's Toli b'machshava, and therefore, since this is Toli b'machshava, ain't no the Moshe Davar Shein Shalom. So there's a gewaltige Shaila. What is the halacha? What's the halacha? If your stove is properly prepared, it's Goref v'Kotim on Shabbos, and you want to take some cholent Friday night. So you'll take the cholent pot off, and we know you're allowed to put it back. It's called chazara. You're allowed to do chazara if there's a whole bunch of conditions. It has to be daitay lachser. You when you took it off, you have to have das to put it back the whole time. You have to have that. You couldn't have put it down. You have to be holding it the whole time, and it still has to be hot, right? Could be there's more tnoim, but those are the three main tnoim you have to have. So what if I have a guest in my house and he's hungry Friday night and he wants to have some of my cholent? and he takes my tool, and he didn't want to put it back. He was going not to put it back. Now I come and say, well, what's going on? I want to put it back. Do you say, since it's the davar toli b'machshava, do you say that he can't answer my toll or not? So there's actually a machlokes achronim about it, and the totally in the following shaila. What is Allah? Is Allah?
Who's machshava? The guest or yours?
Well, that's the question. Could the guest who took it off, since his machshava was not to put it back, will his machshava be able to answer my toll from putting it back? Okay. Just like Yosy says that your machshava of klayim or your machshava of Avodah will not answer my animal. So they say the shalos is like, do you say the moment the pot is taken off the stove, it becomes awesome? Now, in order to be matter it, you need three conditions. Then could be you're going to have a problem because you don't have those conditions. But if it only comes usher if you don't have those conditions, well, yeah, then in fact you can't usher. So there's actually a tumul in the achronim about such a case. And it's not the case. It's not the case. So for halach l'mais, you have to ask the rabbi. Zok to the Gemara we had a shaila. Bandrogenis mali amar shmuel. Because we just said that Rav paskin like Rabbi Yosy by androgynous and by harkava. But Shmuel only spoke about kiddush and kishun. So what would Shmuel hold by androgynous? Tashma, the Amar Shmuel or Rav Anan, or Shmuel told Rav Anan, less of the brisa mekama mesnisim. So clearly Shmuel agrees with what we quoted from Rav, that we paskin like Rabbi Yosy in the Mishnah, who holds that an androgynous is a zachar v'adai. Harkava, Mali Amar Shmuel. What does Shmuel hold about Harkava? Remember that Rav held 2 weeks before the 30-day period, so 2 weeks before Rosh Chodesh El is when you can still do Harkava. Tashma, the Amar Shmuel Ravanan, Tani learn, command the Amar Shloisha Ushloisha. So clearly Shmuel disagrees with Rav. He doesn't hold that it's 2 weeks. He holds that it's 3 days. Now Kushi Mali Amar Rav. Shmuel expressed an opinion by Kushi that it's I don't remember what it was. Was it 2 weeks? Yeah, Shtei Shabbos. The Shmuel paskin that Kusha was 2 Shabbos. What would Rav hold by Kushi? Zok the Gemara, take it. We don't know. We don't have a Meforsha quote what Rav shared his opinion on Kushi. How about Kiddush, where Rabbi Yosy and Shmuel paskin like Rabbi Yosy that Ein Adam Oishu Davar Sheish Shalai, Mali Amarav, Rabbi Yosef Toshma, Amarav Huna Amarav. Now, if you remember, we started this Gemara with Bei Rav, and I told you then from Rashi that that's referring to Rav Huna. So here we have Rav Huna Marav. Ein halacha Rabbi Yosy. The halacha is not like Rabbi Yosy. So here Rav would argue with Shmuel. Amar le Abaye, my chazes the samchas aha. Why are you relying on the opinion of Rav quoted by Rav Huna, who says Ein halacha Rabbi Yosy? Smoich aha. I have another quote from Rav. Amar Rav Ada Amar Rav halacha Rabbi Yosy. Zok the Gemara, Amri Beirav Manu Rav Huna. Beirav, who started this whole sugya, was Rav Huna. Rav Huna Amar Ein halacha. So we're going here according to Rav Huna. This whole thing was based on Rav Huna's quote, where we knew Rav's stuck on 2 things, we didn't know stuck on the other things. So we're going to clarify according to Rav Huna what the stuck will be. According to Rav Huna, it's Ein halacha Rabbi Yosy. So Rashi just tells us a very interesting FYI, an interesting piece of information, that Beirav doesn't always mean Rav Huna. It depends who's saying it. So let's just quickly jump into Rashi, the third line from the top. Ami Beirav is Rav Hamnuna. Even though somewhere else we know there's halacha, it was said that when we say Beirav, it's referring to Rav Hamnuna. The Rashi, Hainu Heicha, the Amar Rav Huna, the Amri Beirav. When Rav Huna's quotes Beirav, it can't mean Rav Huna. He's himself. When Rav Huna quotes Beirav, there we say that it means Rav Huna. The Milcha Milta, the Ina Shachrina Ka'amar. It's clearly that Rav Huna is talking about somebody else. But when the Gemara quotes Tama Amr Beirav, that they have a Rav Huna. That's always Rav Huna. So that's a good rule to learn. Beirav always means Rav Huna, except when it's Rav Huna speaking, then Rav Huna means Rav Hamnuna. Rav Yehuda Aimer Tumtum. So Rav Yehuda, the Tumtum has the halacha of a shritz. So therefore, let's look back at the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, it says, even if the Tumtum is torn open, Zok the Heilige Mishnah, Rav Yehuda Aimer Tumtum Shanikra V'dim Shezocher still lo yachloit mipnei shehu k'shritz. Now the way we would understand it is he's a vaday shritz. He's a vaday shritz. He's not mechayev a woman in Yibum, and therefore he's not mechayev a woman in Chalitza. So let's see what the Gemara says about this. Amalei Rav Ami. Rav Ami said, "My Ovid lay Rav Yehuda le tumtum debir." Rav Yehuda, who says unequivocally that a tumtum could not have children, how is he going to explain the famous tumtum that we found in the city of Biri? The Usvu Abe Kursei, he sat on the chair. The shadow of that means he got married. Those who means he got married. Those who means he was on a surgical table. The Ikra, he was torn open. And he had 7 children. Rabbi Yehuda says unequivocally, this man is a shris. This is a Ma'aser Shahaya. He had children. So I want to stop for a second because there was an old man who wanted very much to have children, and he went to his doctor and says, "I want to have children." So his doctor says, "I'm sorry to be a man that's 95 years old can't have children anymore." So he says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I have a friend who's 95 and he just had a child. So I'm not going to have a child." So the doctor, what? Yeah. So the doctor tells this man, "I want to tell you a story. You're telling me a story about a 95-year-old man who had a child. I want to tell you a story. There's a guy who took an umbrella and he aimed it at a deer because he wanted to go hunting, and he shot the deer with the umbrella, and the deer died." But the old man said, "That's impossible. You cannot shoot with an umbrella." He says, "Yeah, but the deer died." He says, "Go ahead. The deer died because probably someone was shooting from a different angle and killed the deer." He says, "Atasa." So Zok to Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, "You're asking me a kasha from this tumtum of Biri?" And let me tell you about this tumtum of Biri. You got to find where those children came from, because I can tell you Babadoyas that the children didn't come from him, but the tumtum is a spis. Tanya Rabbi Yosy Bar Yehuda Omer. Tumtum lo yachloitz. A tumtum should not do chalitza. So let's just get clear. Rabbi Yehuda said Babadoyas, a tumtum is considered a shris. He cannot have children. But Rabbi Yosy Bar Yehuda, who was Rabbi Yehuda's son, said differently. He said it b'toyer sofek. Tumtum lo yachloitz. A tumtum shouldn't do chalitza. Shema yikra. But Nimsa Shris Chama, because maybe he's a Shris. He's not a Bade Shris, he's only a suffix Shris. Frek to Gemara, what do you mean? Atu called the Mikra Zachar Hava? Who even says he's a Zachar? Maybe he's in the Keva. Before you're saying if we tear him up, he might be a Shris. How do you know he's a Zachar? Zach Gemara, you're right. Hachik Omar. Shema Yikra v'Nimsa in the Keva. First of all, we don't even know if he's a Zachar in the Keva. And even if he's a Zachar, Bafil Nimsa Zachar, Shema Yimsa Shris Chama, and therefore, in a suffix, you cannot do chalitza. My beinai, what's the difference halacha between the Yehuda who holds it's a vadai shris and the Yosy who holds it's only a suffix shris? Amarava, 2 nafkaminas. Lisel b'makamah. What happens if there's multiple brothers who this woman fell to evil? All of the brothers are regular healthy males. One of the brothers is a tumtum. So the halacha is, what happens if this tumtum went and made chalitza on this woman? Would it now passel her from doing Ibum? If you hold that it's a shris vadai like Rabbi Yehuda, well then his chalitza does nothing at all, and after his chalitza, the other brothers can still go and do Ibum because his chalitza was nothing. But if you hold it's only a suffix, well then once he did chalitza, it's going to force one of the other brothers to do chalitza only and not Ibum because maybe he's not a shris. That's one afkamina. The second afkamina is what happens if there is only one brother, this person? If it's a suffix, then he has to do chalitza, which is what Rabbi Yosy Bar Yehuda holds. But Rabbi Yehuda holds, he's a vadai shris, he doesn't have to do chalitza. This woman can walk free, and she could marry somebody else. Ikabanai, those are the 2 differences between if we consider the tumtum a vadai shris like Rabbi Yehuda or a suffix shris like Rabbi Yosy Bar Yehuda. Amar Shmuel Bar Yehuda Amar Bava. Achud Rabbi Yehuda Bar Zavdi Amar Rav. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. So we have a very long yichus belief again. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Abba, who was the brother who was Achud Rabbi Yehuda Bar Zavdi, who was the brother of Yehuda Bar Zavdi, who said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, who said in the name of Rav. And Reagan is Chayovin Olav Skila Mishtei Mekayim. So we had this shiloh yesterday. Very good. So the halach is Chayovin Oskim Mishtei Mekayim, meaning we learned yesterday that an androgynous has a makam zachars, has a makam nakbus. If someone was boiled, if a zachar was boiled an androgynous, in either one of those 2 places, that's mishkav zachar and there's a chi of skila. Because we had another mandamer who held that it would only be chayiv skila if the bia was b'makom zakris, which is where normal mishkav zachar would take place. Meisvei freik the Gemara. Rabbi Lazar Amar, androgynous chayavin alaskia kiva zachar. What does it mean kiva zachar? Just like a regular male. Amed devar mamurim bezachar shaloi. Albumanek was shaloi potter. So you see a stira. On one hand, we have one town who says it's mishnei mekaymis, but from the other hand, we see it's only on in one makom, in the makom zakos. So tomorrow, who the Omar kehai Tanya? In fact, it's totally no machlekes Tanoim. The Tanya, and now we're going to darshan the psukim carefully to see where we learn from if the bia is a chiyuv skila in both places or only in one. The Tanya Rab Simoy Omer, androgynous chayovin Allah skila mishtei mekaymis. So you see, there's a machlekes Tanoim. My time is Rab Simoy. What is the reason for Rab Simoy? Amar Rabba Bar Hamdui Asber Ali. The pasuk says, "Ve'zachar loy sishkav mishkevei isha." Ve'es zachar loy sishkav mishkevei isha. A zachar you shouldn't be shaycha with the shchivas of a woman. Eizehus. So this pasuk, Rab Simoy, is mamish talking the dafka about an androgynous. Why? Because it's talking about a zachar who has mishkavos. It's talking about a zachar who you can be boil him in two different ways. Eizeu zachar. So yes, by shnei mishkavos. What type of zachar? What type of person who has the halachic status of a zachar? Yet you can be boiled him in two separate ways. Havoim is androgynous. So kolor, this pasuk is referring specifically to an androgynous, and it says the zachar. The Rabbanon hold avagav the isbei shnei mishkavos. Even though, so if you hold that your chayiv skila mishnei becomes like Simoy, it's because it says the zachar the shishk of mishkavei isha. We're talking about an androgynous, and both mishkavos are also. Both mishkavos are also. Therefore, the Simoy holds in both places the mishnei becomes it's going to be a chayiv skila. But Rabbanan will hold that there's only a chayiv skila if the mishkav zachar is the normal mishkav zachar. It's avagav this mishnei mishkavos. Sure, I agree with you that when it says mishkavei isha, the Torah is trying to tell us that we're talking about an androgynous. But what is the isser that appears by an androgynous? Es zachar. So if es zachar, mishkavei isha. If you have an androgynous, what is the isser to do? The es zachar. The isser is to do the bia that you do on the zachar, but not the bia on the keva. So therefore, it's only one mishkav, only mimakam echad. It's going to be the chiyuv, the rice of skila. I'm sorry? By a zucher, there's a point in the Rabbanon, zracha greda minalu. According to the Rabbanon, who says that the ve'es zachar is referring bedavka to an androgynous, Bishlam, according to Rab Shimoi, Lashishka Mishkavish is referring to both. So ve'es zachar is telling you that not only is an androgynous chayiv skila if you boil him, but even a regular zucher, it's also if you're boiling. But according to the Rabbanon, that the es zachar is talking bedavka by an androgynous to tell you that even by an androgynous, it's only the bia of a zachar. The b'makam zachar, only there is it going to be chayiv skila. How does he stam know mishkav zachar? How does he b'chalal know that there's an isser mishkav zachar? So it's up to Gemara. Rabban aval gav ishkei shnei mishkav zachar. Say Rabban is a zachar grade minole. It's up to Gemara. Mi the s isha. I believe the base in the back sticks in. The back sticks in the base. Mi the s isha. Right? Because what does it say in the pasuk? The s isha lo yisishkav mishkavei. The s zachar. The s zachar. So from the S, we learn that it also applies to a zachar. It says, he brings down the S. Is it the vav of the S or is it the whole word S? It depends on if you dash in vav in or not. Remember we had a couple of blot ago? If you have to have the whole word extra, ubas or the vav. But there's some extra there. I understood that it was the whole word, the S, but I don't know. Now, according to everybody, how do you know the issue like a This pasuk is fully occupied. The es zachar to tell you that it's a mishkav zachar, mishkav isha, either one of the mishkavos are going to be also. So how do you b'chalal know that if you're boiled isha shaloi kedaka, that's called a proper bia? Tomorrow, mi the isha. You know it from the isha. So let's see Rashi. Rashi says shaloi kedaka minolu bein lamar have a bia in anchi shalarayis. So he doesn't bring it down, but it's from the Isha. It says, may the S it says. Oh, here it says miva s. I have a thing that says, do you have an art scroll? What does he say from which word? I think it's from the Isha, but
Okay, they're both in brackets.
right. So that's it. Look in the art scroll, not on the Gemara. Look in the English.
They're derived from the word woman.
So which word is not in brackets? Which word does he have not in brackets?
Ne Isha is in a French, like in the former.
Right.
Ne de Isha.
But the eerste woord is
And bracket.
Oh, okay. So I think what it's saying is so the way we know that a bia of a woman like darka is a bia asura is because it could have said bezachar lashishkav mishkave. Why do you need the word isha afterwards? The word isha afterwards tells you that this also refers to an isha that a bia like is considered a bia. That's how I'm saying.
The fact that there it says Mishkava Isha, the cohabitation of a woman indicates that a woman has also has two cohabitations.
That's right. Because otherwise it could have just said plain mishkave. Okay. Amrab Shizbi, Amrab Chista. So at the end of the day, just to summarize, we have a machlokes whether or not when someone is boiled, not wet, chas v'shom rachman, if someone is boiled, a male is boiled, an androgynous, there's for sure a chi of skila, according to Yosy, who learns the Vadei Zachar. The question really is the chi of skila only if you boil him where the normal bishuk of Zachar is, or even if you boil b'makam nak. There's a machlokes there. We know that psukim, but it's also important to know that this pasuk is chock full of information. This pasuk is teaching us that a bia on a woman, even a bia shalai kedash, is considered a bia. It tells us that there's an isra of mishkav zachar, and it tells us that there's an isra of mishkav zachar by an androgynous, and which makim is the isra for. So there's a lot of information that we learn from this pasuk. Amar should be Amar Pchista. Loy lechol Amar Rabbi Eliezer androgynous zachar ma'al. Even though Rabbi Eliezer said that an androgynous is a zachar and therefore he's chayiv skila for mishkavei isha, a zachar who's boiling is chayiv skila because he's boiled a mishkav zachar, but there are halachas where even Rabbi Eliezer who holds your chayiv skila, so it's surely a zachar, but there are certain halachas that it's not a zachar for. Shemata Eimer came b'mikdashin yikdash. The halacha is certain karbanos have to be male animals. Would you be able to be makish an animal that was an androgynous when the animal has to be a male? Rabbi Eliezer says black and white, of course not. So you see, even though Rabbi Eliezer considers an androgynous to be a male, that's legabe these halachas that we discussed. Legabe kedushin, legabe truma, legabe mishkav zachar, but legabe that this should be considered a male, legabe being makavit for carbon, that not. How do we know that? When we know them like how do you know that? How do you know Taka the Rebbe hold that an animal would not be qualified? The Tana Rabban we learned. Now we're talking about birds. We're talking about a bird that was brought as a carbon. Hanirba. What if the bird was a nirba? Don't ask me exactly how that occurred. But if you had a bird that was a nirba, or a bird that was mukset, was set aside for avodah zara, but never the bird that someone was taka over avodah zara, or by esnan. This bird was given in exchange for his nose. Mechir, this bird was acquired in exchange for a dog. Or if the bird is a tumtum, or if the bird is an androgynous, mitamin begodim abesabliya. Now we know that the way we are preparing birds to eat would be with shchita. But karbanos of birds were not done with shchita, they were done with malika. If you do malika on a chulam bird, you've made it into a nevela. You made it a nevela. Only birds of kachim can you use malika for. So if I have a bird that's not ready to be a carbon, and I make malika on it, it's obviously a nevela, right? How does the nevelas oif tahar make you tamei? If you touch the nevela of an oif tahar, you don't become tamei. The only way to become tamei from a nevelas oif tahar is by eating it, and as it goes into the base of bliya, as you swallow it, that's when it's mitamei. So zok the brisa, all of these types of birds mitamei begodim base of bliya. You know why? Because they're not carbonates. So an androgynous, you see clearly a bird that's an androgynous is not a good carbon. Rabbi Eliezer Aimer, tumtum v'androgynous ein mitamei begodim base of bliya. When it comes to birds, a tumtum and androgynous bird will be a kosher carbon. Will be a kosher carbon. So Rabbi Eliezer Aimer, whenever the Torah describes a carbon needing to be either a zachar or a nekeva, then atamoiti tumtum v'androgynous mi b'neihem. So by all behemoth carbonas, with the Torah is specific, it either says zachar or nekeva, and a tumtum and androgynous animal is possible. The oith, I only argue by oith, hoil but never by zachu nekeva, since by oith it never mentions zachu nekeva. The Torah never mentions the gender of a bird when it talks about a bird for a carbon. Therefore, yat moitzi tumtum androgynous b'nei. But a behemoth, even Rabbi Eliezer clearly agrees that a behemoth of an androgynous is not a zachar, is not an nekeva, and you can't bring it for a carbon. So you see clearly, even though Rabbi Eliezer holds an androgynous is zachar, the gabi a carbon, it's not a zachar. Okay, we can stop here.